afternoon to the National Security Policy Speaker Series. The series is a joint effort of collaboration between the Center for Peace and Security Studies and GPS's Korea Pacific program led by cPASS. This is the first year of the program. We've had a number of very influential speakers. We're lucky today. Our fourth speaker is Brad Roberts. Brad is the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He previously served as the the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, the DASD, for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy under President Obama, where he helped direct the U.S.'s nuclear posture review. He's a former member of the research staff at the Institute for Defense Analysis. He's also held professorships as a Perry Fellow and consulting professor at CSAC at Stanford University and at George Washington University. He's authored a number of influential publications, perhaps most notably and recently his book, The Case for U.S. Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, which was published in 2016 by Stanford University Press. The title of his talk is Continuity and Change in U.S. Nuclear Policy from the Cold War to President Trump. I wish all of you will join me in welcoming Brad Roberts to speak to us today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for finding time for the conversation today on a topic that most people would rather put off to another day. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Steph, for the opportunity to be here. There we go. We lost the signal on the screen behind. Does that matter? So I'm going to talk about the evolution of U.S. nuclear policy since the end of the Cold War as a way to try and put the Trump administration's policy in a kind of broader context. And then I'm happy to take the conversation in whatever direction you would like. I want to make clear that the views here that I express are my own. Please don't attribute them to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory or the Department of Energy or any other source. They're mine. The story of the evolution of U.S. nuclear policy since the end of the Cold War, of course, begins with the George H.W. Bush administration. And in some ways, that administration, in a very short period of time, accomplished the most dramatic changes to the U.S. nuclear posture and strategy with the end of the Cold War. The vast majority of the force was taken off of alert. We had been, to that point, keeping bombers in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They also retired a lot of forces. Most of the new forces that had been built, the new ICBM at the time was the Peacekeeper was retired quickly, and of course the purchase of additional bombers was curtailed at that point. So and these were called the Presidential Nuclear Initiatives. They were non-binding and unilateral, but they were also reciprocal. The understanding was that Russia was going to follow suit, and indeed it did. And there were a couple of rounds of these. Given the Asia-Pacific interest of this community, I should also note that one of the biggest decisions taken in the presidential nuclear initiatives of that administration was to withdraw all of the U.S. nuclear weapons that had been deployed in Korea and deploy all U.S. nuclear weapons that had been aboard naval surface combatants. So the only nuclear weapons left in the Navy were in the ballistic missile submarines. And there was essentially no U.S. nuclear presence in Asia. In Europe, in contrast, the number of nuclear weapons forward deployed as a part of our extended deterrence commitment to Europe, to NATO, came down in that decade 97%. So 3% of the 1991 total remain today in Europe. This, of course, these decisions followed from a view of the changing security environment. And indeed, this is where, each of the, so I should back up a step, each subsequent administration then came in and did a review of U.S. nuclear policy and posture. These are the nuclear posture reviews. Every administration during the Cold War reviewed nuclear policy and posture, but the formal nuclear posture reviews really began in 1994 with the Clinton administration. And all of these reviews begin with, they have a starting point of some kind, some political starting point. The Clinton administration's starting point was, of course, the Cold War's gone away. The U.S. has a military and defense strategy that's in 1992 all about the Cold War, a nuclear force posture that's all about the Soviet Union, which has also gone away. And so that administration saw the need for a, quote, bottom-up review of defense strategy, often misremembered in our community as the bottoms-up review, like, empty your beer glass. And this was followed then, that was the starting point for the Clinton administration. And they followed their bottom-up review of defense strategy with a nuclear posture review, the first nuclear posture review. And that was a review that was quite narrow in scope. It was conducted by maybe this many people, probably fewer actually, and they were all in the Pentagon. And they were basically asked a simple question: what do we do with the U.S. nuclear arsenal after the Cold War? And their main theme and their strategy was lead but hedge. Lead in moving together with Russia and the post-Soviet states in moving away from the Cold War nuclear forces, Cold War nuclear strategy, Cold War nuclear competition, and towards deeper reductions, towards the strengthening of the nuclear nonproliferation regime. This was 1994. 1995 was the 25-year anniversary of the NPT. The decision needed to be taken to extend it. But lead but hedge against the possibility that we might wake up one morning and discover that there had been another coup in Moscow, but this time a successful coup. And the people who would then be back in control in Moscow wouldn't be the people who were feeling some affinity towards a closer relationship with the West, or even the old Soviet elite that had come to accept that nuclear war could not be won and thus must not be fought. So hedge against the possible erosion suddenly of the security environment. Each of these reviews, so each has a starting point, conceptually, politically. Each has a view of the security environment, and then each has to make a set of decisions about declaratory policy, for example, or force structure. Do I keep the triad? Can I move away from the nuclear strategy the United States has had, and can I move towards minimum deterrence? Can I change declaratory policy in some way? All presidents have wanted to reduce, since the end of the Cold War, have wanted to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. How do I do that? Every president has asked that up until the current administration. The Clinton administration was also interested in the then newly emerging problem represented by Saddam Hussein and North Korea. This was the problem in American military strategy called the new problem of major theater war with a WMD dimension. Major theater war, not the Cold War, not a peer adversary, but a really messy circumstance when we began to understand what Saddam had in the way of WMD and might have been able to do with them. This was a kind of new planning paradigm for U.S. military strategy, including U.S. deterrence strategy. Something that was conspicuous also in this period that bears on our understanding of our national nuclear strategy is the dumbing down that occurred in the federal government and nationally on these questions. Nationally, universities that used to turn out students doing deterrence studies, nuclear studies, and the like axed their programs. The executive branch, the president used to depend for advice on matters nuclear on the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, closed in 1996 as a part of a bargain with Jesse Helms. The Congress had something called the Office of Technology Assessment, and also the Senate Arms Control Observers Group, also gone in the 1990s. The Defense Department did its nuclear business with the Defense Nuclear Agency, closed in 1997. And there was a general hollowing out of our expertise in these areas, and similarly, as we began to appreciate in so much the rest of our national political life, a hollowing out of the middle politically. The nuclear debate, as you all know, if you follow any piece of it in our country, has two camps, deeply divided. They don't really debate. They have different worldviews, different assumptions, different beliefs. And in the Cold War and for a while thereafter, the need to make important policy decisions compelled the middle to function. But after the Cold War, there really haven't been very many important nuclear policy decisions to make about our forces, our strategy, our arms control approach. Now I think that's coming to an end, but I'll come to that point in the story. But the 1990s was when we really began to see the hollowing out in the middle. The George W. Bush administration came along. Here the starting point is a little convoluted. So a nuclear posture review is generally speaking an obligation levied on the executive branch by the Congress. It wasn't in 1994, but it was in 2001. The Congress wanted to get the new administration on the hook on nuclear strategy. The nuclear posture review that I directed also had congressional guidance. And this determined the scope of the guidance. Let me come back to that. The nuclear posture review is one of the obligations levied on the executive branch by the Congress to report. There's a prior obligation, which is to provide a national security strategy. This is a response to the early Reagan defense buildup. The Congress got this massive defense buildup plan from the Reagan administration, but there was no strategy by which to assess whether this investment made sense or that investment had been overlooked. So the Congress in 1982 obliged the executive to do a national security strategy, and that's an enduring requirement of every new administration. And it's supposed to explain to the Congress and to the American people and to interested international partners our overall national security strategy. The Congress then liked the bottom-up review done by the Clinton administration in 1994 and turned this into an obligation to do what was for 20 years called the Quadrennial Defense Review and is now just called the Defense Strategy Review. And then comes the Nuclear Posture Review as an obligation of the Congress. And on my watch, 8 years ago, there was also an obligation to do a Ballistic Missile Defense Review. Well, the Bush administration arrived and it first did its Nuclear Posture Review, then it did its Defense Strategy Review, and then it did its National Security Strategy, which it revised, which was almost done when 9/11 happened. And so it got revised and reformulated. So it's actually difficult to describe the core ideas of the Bush approach to this. And this is in part because they produced a classified report. They were prepared to do an unclassified one, but they sent the classified one to the Congress. It leaked within about an hour, literally. And then it's illegal to provide a redacted version of a classified report. Redaction is where you black out the parts of the text that are classified, because if you do that, then you can compare the two texts and see what's classified. You're confirming the classified information. So the George W. Bush administration was kind of hamstrung for a variety of reasons in explaining its nuclear strategy. But it too began with a view of the security environment, which was basically, as you may recall, it's getting worse quickly. And they talked about the axis of evil, the nexus of terrorism, the nexus of tyranny and WMD, and terrorists and rogue states, and their basic view of the proliferation problem was that our non-proliferation tools were failing us, our deterrent tools were failing us, and we needed to eliminate these problems rather than manage them or try to live with them through deterrent strategies. So they took a very strong view of the dangers posed by nuclear proliferation, and put a particular emphasis, of course, on the linkage between the proliferation programs of North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, and terrorist access to these capabilities. Their story on the major power relationships in the security environment underwent a sea change because of 9/11. You may recall, those of you old enough to recall, in the 1999, Condi Rice wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs magazine promising that if Republicans were elected, there would be a realpolitik view of dealing with Russia and with major powers generally. And then came 9/11, and the national security strategy talked about, in the major power piece, the relations with Russia and China, that we had moved from a period of contention and fighting over the balance of power. We were putting these relationships onto a new footing of increasingly common interests, responsibilities, and values. This was not at all Russia and China are around the corner as our next enemy. The Bush administration took a kind of revolutionary view. Well, all of this had an implication for their choices about nuclear strategy and posture. They decided to cut unilaterally U.S. nuclear forces. They said arms control is a barrier to accomplishing nuclear reductions. It takes too long. Look at these thick, fat treaties negotiated by lawyers, 200-300 pages, takes a decade to do, another decade to get through the Congress. Let's just set the number of nuclear weapons that we think are enough and go there, which is exactly what they did. Mr. Putin pled and was successful in getting them to agree to the Moscow Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, which basically obliged them to do what they'd already decided to do, and it's 2 paragraphs long as a treaty. The George W. Bush administration did something interesting in attaching its nuclear strategy to defense strategy. The defense strategy of the George W. Bush administration had 4 main goals: to assure allies, to dissuade potential competitors, and to deter and defeat enemies. Assure, dissuade, deter, defeat. And they asked nuclear weapons to support all of those roles. So there was much more emphasis on extended deterrence in 2001 than there had been in 1994. There was much more emphasis on China as a rising actor. And Secretary Rumsfeld talked about the possibility of a Chinese sprint to nuclear parity. In 2001 and 2, he talked about this. Assure, dissuade, deter, and defeat. Defeat led them also to introduce ballistic missile defenses as an important part of our overall strategic posture. Until that point, we, the United States, had basically honored the ABM Treaty, from which the George W. Bush administration withdrew. The starting point for the Obama nuclear posture review actually came 2 years earlier, when the Congress looked around the political landscape of nuclear policy and said, my God, this is a mess. And we charged the next administration, of whichever political stripe it might be. This was in 2008, this law. We charged the next administration with doing a nuclear posture review that, in my words, will go soup to nuts. So it's not just nuclear deterrence strategy, nuclear forces, nuclear declaratory policy, but it's nuclear arms control, nuclear nonproliferation, nuclear counterterrorism, nuclear disarmament, the whole story. And it would be interagency in character, with the Department of Defense in the lead. That was a first ever. And it would be, in their hope, helpful in reaffirming some bipartisan aspect, because any of you who recall the George W. Bush years recall that bipartisanship on most issues disappeared. The middle was really gone then. And the Congress also observed that this period where we'd been able to accept the division and the paralysis in our policy process was coming to an end, because we'd been we see some decisions coming, the Congress did 8, 9, 10 years ago, about the modernization of U.S. nuclear forces, or their replacement, or their retirement. And we could see some decisions coming about arms control, meaning the entire arms control framework was going away in 2011. START 1 was due to expire. And already in 2007, there was evidence of Russia's noncompliance with its INF treaty obligations. So the Congress said, so there are some hard questions coming, and if we don't have some bipartisan support to them, we're going to be stuck as a nation. So they created a Congressional Commission on the Future of the U.S. Strategic Posture, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, Secretaries of Defense, former Secretaries Perry and Schlesinger in charge, and the commission was asked 2 simple questions. Is there anything you can agree about, because it sure doesn't look like it, and if so, what? And the answer of the commission was almost no, we can't agree about anything. 2 completely different worldviews. And they contemplated this possibility and thought that in light of what was already then evident in Russia's strategies and choices, and North Korea at that point, which had resumed its push, and China's ongoing modernization, that this would be a catastrophe if we had political paralysis in the making of nuclear policy. And so the commission said, well, they recommended what they considered the tradition of U.S. nuclear policy, that you would combine political and economic means and diplomatic means to reduce and eliminate nuclear dangers, nuclear weapons, but so long as those dangers remain, you would have a credible and effective deterrent to protect yourself and your allies. The so-called balanced approach that would have both of these elements. And they said, so long as you do that to the next administration, that we should enjoy some bipartisan support. And that report of the Strategic Posture Commission is available online. And it was very influential as a starting point for the Obama administration, because many of the people who went into the Obama administration had served with Republicans in the Strategic Posture Commission. I was one of those. I wasn't a commissioner, but I was involved in the process. And it was clear that so the president gave his speech in Prague, remembered by everyone in the room, I presume, and then turned to the congressionally mandated interagency DoD-led process and said, okay, now come up with a plan. Come up with a plan to take practical steps towards the long-term goal, but so long as nuclear weapons remain, make sure we have a plan to ensure that they are safe, secure, and effective for the problems for which they need to be effective. And each president has had a learning curve on nuclear topics, and we can come to Mr. Trump's learning curve. But President Obama had a learning curve. One was the preparation of the Prague speech, and the other was what followed, which was 3 weeks later came the North Korean thank you gift for the speech, its underground nuclear test. And 2 days later, there were phone calls from the president of South Korea and the prime minister of Japan. Now, I wasn't party to the phone calls, so I don't have firsthand experience, so please understand that. But the tone of the phone calls were, Mr. President, lovely speech in Prague, and if there's anything we can do to help you accomplish the ambition of reducing and eliminating nuclear dangers, well, that'd make a big difference in Northeast Asia, and we're all for it, and what can we do to help? This is part of the way that South Korea became the host of the second Nuclear Materials Security Summit. This began in this conversation. But oh, by the way, Mr. President, on the way to Prague, are you going to close what's left of the nuclear umbrella? Because if you do, we're not going to feel more secure, and who knows what we might have to do. Well, he gave us specific instructions to define ways. There was a policy debate about what verb to use on this topic. Was it to sustain extended deterrence and assurance of allies, improve, or strengthen? And he said strengthen. Give me options for strengthening extended deterrence and the assurance of our allies, which turned out to be a big driver of a lot of Obama nuclear choices. So we received written instructions from the White House and set up an interagency process. It was a process that ran in 3 phases: a review of the security environment, a discussion of strategy and forces, and then a long round of meetings at the White House, which were very effective at generating leadership buy-in to the result, which is an important thing to have. In our view of the security environment 8-9 years ago, the overall view was mixed trends, but we're cautiously optimistic. But of course, a part of the mix was the U.S.-Russian relationship, which was not good and hadn't been going in the right direction for a while. Part of the mix was the U.S.-China relationship, where there's a lot of cooperation, but some flashpoints and difficulties. Part of the mix was the nuclear programs of Iran and North Korea. And still very much on our minds at the time was the advice from the Posture Commission, which said the main nuclear problem that U.S. strategy has to be effective for is the problem presented by regional challengers and terrorists. The President believed and repeated what the Posture Commission had said, which also, by the way, the outgoing George W. Bush administration had used the same words to say that the risk of nuclear attack on the United States has gone down significantly since the end of the Cold War, but the risk that a nuclear weapon might be employed anywhere in the world, including against the United States, has probably gone up. And that's because of the access of states like North Korea, Iran, and terrorists with whom they sometimes interact to these capabilities. And the President wanted to have a strategy that was going to be very effective for that particular problem. So that was the view of the security environment that informed the posture review, in which it was my pleasure to play a role. We did set out an agenda for implementing his Prague vision. He didn't ask, what can the nation do in 20 or 30 or 50 years for nuclear disarmament? He asked, if we're sufficiently ambitious, what are the things we might be able to accomplish to make progress on the pathway towards zero in 8 years, assuming re-election? And we set out an agenda, which was in U.S.-Russian relations, having a bridge of arms control beyond the expiring START treaty that would allow us the time to sort out a much more transformative agreement. Well, what happened? Yeah, the Russians weren't interested in this part. We set out a strategy for engaging China. In 2009 and 10, as we were contemplating how deep to go into the new START treaty, both Moscow and Washington said, we want more confidence than we've got that our reductions aren't going to be met by a Chinese decision to come up. We want to all be on this pathway, not a competitive pathway. How do we get that confidence? Well, China is not going to join an arms control process. China doesn't even acknowledge how many nuclear weapons it has. We all have a number in mind. That's a number that the U.S. government has put in place somewhere, not the Chinese government. So our basic approach was maybe over time we could build with China a dialogue on these topics, on the nuclear relationship, create Chinese confidence and transparency in the nuclear domain where it hasn't had much, and maybe with a common view of strategic stability, China could then at some point say something like, we're not going to tell you how many nuclear weapons we have, but we think it's enough for now in the foreseeable circumstances, and we don't have an intention to have more. Which isn't to say we don't forswear more. Which isn't to say we forswear more. Well, what success do we have to show for that? Well, the Chinese wouldn't even agree to a dialogue on strategic stability. Thirdly, the administration set out an approach to turning back the nuclear programs in Iran and North Korea. You can judge, I'm sure you have your own views of its progress in that regard. And lastly, we tried to work with our allies to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in extended deterrence. Well, I foreshadowed part of the answer already. Our Northeast Asian allies were extremely anxious about that possibility, as were as were, roughly speaking, the newer members of NATO, who would sit very politely in meetings with me at NATO, silent during the general session, and then during the coffee break they'd come up and poke me in the chest and say, don't you dare take your nuclear weapons out of Europe, what's left of them. That's why we joined the alliance. We're counting on you. We're not counting on, we know that, went the argument, the French won't come to our defense in extremis. You will. And because we face a nuclear adversary, you'd better have nuclear weapons and they'd better be here. That's what's assuring to us. Very clear messages. So, on the Prague pathway, as reflected in the Nuclear Posture Review, a lot of disappointments. Which brings us to the Trump administration. Now, what's the starting point for the Trump administration's Nuclear Posture Review? The starting point is, of course, the presidential statements on the campaign trail. I have a catalog of things the president said on the campaign trail, bearing on things in the Nuclear Posture Review. And if you could imagine the posture review based on that might have been written on January 22nd, 2017, it's quite radically different from the review that resulted. The review that resulted is very calm and largely in the mainstream of U.S. nuclear policy. Its view of the security environment reflects the underlying truths as we experienced them in the Obama administration, which is to say we had only partial success in rolling back the programs of proliferation concern. We had no success in engaging China, and we had the first step of success in engaging Russia, but of course on the Obama watch, Russia's entire relationship with the West shifted in a profound way. And I'm not unhappy with the formulation in the Trump national security strategy, national defense strategy, and nuclear posture review that we've re-entered a period of major power rivalry. And we can't, as the George W. Bush administration said, we can't just say, well, Russia's not our enemy, our nuclear deterrent isn't about Russia anymore. If it comes back, we'll worry about it later. Russia and China are real security questions for us. But of course, one of the spins that the administration has put on this that none of the prior administrations did was the competitive strategies business. So the language of the prior NPRs was about deterrence, assurance, dissuasion, and defeat, but deterrence and risk reduction, arms control strategies, and the like. This NPR introduces a theme that hasn't been there before, which is if we're in a period of major power rivalry and we're successful in deterrence, that means we have a long-term problem in front of us, which is how to compete with these major power adversaries. And in the 1970s, there were a set of ideas developed in response to what was then observed. We had an arms race underway that the United States occasionally paused. And the then Secretary of Defense in the Carter period, Harold Brown, famously said, "We build, they build. We stop, they build." What explained that the Soviets were going down this pathway of constantly cranking out nuclear weapons? Was it just because they were good at cranking them out, making sausage, as the saying went? Or did they have a theory of victory of some kind that they were building up to, that they thought if they had the right mix of capabilities, they could fight a big war in Europe that would be nuclear and win it, or that wouldn't go nuclear because of their capabilities. And if they had a theory of victory, should we have a theory of victory? And that became a discussion of competitive strategies. Could we define a way of compelling the Soviets to compete with us that would ultimately bankrupt them in areas where they couldn't afford not to compete but could never believe they'd catch up? And Star Wars was the epitome of this idea. And of course, a few short years later, the Soviet Union was gone. So people who believed in these competitive strategies said, see, they work. I go through all of that history because that's a set of ideas that's buried in this nuclear posture review. This is a significant element of change as opposed to continuity. And I think, so again, from your Asia-Pacific interest, what does it mean to embrace China as a country that would be the object of our competitive strategies? When we embraced the Soviet Union as the object, it was failing economically and on the brink of political collapse, as it turned out. China is not failing economically. There is probably no area where we can compel China to compete that it would conclude it can't. And who has the superior resource base for long-term competition? That's an open question today. Trump administration. So I've talked about the security environment, their view of the major power rivalry piece. Of course, the strength of their views about the North Korean and Iranian problems. They had a debate about what to say about the terrorist problem. Was the advice of the Strategic Posture Commission of 2008 still germane? Would you still say that the biggest risk of a nuclear weapon going off anywhere in the world is the risk that a terrorist will do it because they got it from North Korea or Iran? And they ended up saying that that remains a priority, dealing with that problem, but it's not the first priority. The first priority is maintaining a stable strategic relationship with our main major power competitors. The administration also made a strong commitment to extended deterrence. And if you will, I think this is an element of continuity across all of these reviews, the return of extended deterrence. In the 1990s, people almost never spoke about it anymore. And it was a huge issue in the 1960s. In the 1990s, we brought all the nuclear weapons home. Nobody thought about it. And then it began to come back up in salience. It was important for the Obama administration, but even more so for this administration. And of course, this administration has to take on the two questions that the Congress was anticipating in 2007 and that we, the Obama administration, set out an approach to. What are the two problems? A long-term arms control strategy to reduce nuclear, so remember the balanced approach, political and economic and diplomatic means to reduce and eliminate dangers while maintaining a safe, secure, and effective deterrent. There are big choices now in front of the nation on both of these topics. On maintaining safe and secure and effective, basically our national leadership has been very good at avoiding this question for a long time. So remember, the George H.W. Bush administration retired most of the new stuff at the time. So the newest part of the U.S. nuclear triad are the submarines, the ballistic missile submarines. They all went into service in the 1980s, 15 months apart. They're also going to age out quicker than anything else. They're 15 months apart, beginning in 2027. The next oldest part of the nuclear triad are the ICBMs. The newest, not the oldest, the newest ICBM went into the ground in 1971. The newest B-52 flying the nuclear mission is a decade older. The last pilot of a nuclear B-52 hasn't yet been born. That plane will fly 100 years. And the nuclear weapons, on average, were expected to be on the shelf for 20 years. And the newest one went into the arsenal in 1990. Some of them still have vacuum tubes in them. So, so we as a nation can't coast on the past investments anymore. Either we will make the investments in modernizing these capabilities, or they will go away. There's no past practice to continue. And these are, of course, politically charged questions. These are big bills. They're affordable bills. At its peak, nuclear modernization. So currently, the United States spends about 2% of the defense budget to maintain and operate nuclear forces. At the peak of the modernization wave in 2023, we would spend about 7% of the defense budget, or 6%, depending on what you count. That's affordable, but it's a lot of money. So I said there are two sets of decisions. There's that decision, and then there's the arms control set of decisions to make, the political tools. The New START Treaty expires in 2021, so in the Trump administration's first term, unless it's extended, which can be done once by mutual agreement of Washington and Moscow for 5 years. The New START Treaty is the only one of 8 major arms control agreements with which Russia remains in compliance. You all know about the INF Treaty, but the CFE Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, the list goes on. Mr. Putin has clearly articulated that the arms control regime was foisted upon Russia in its moment of weakness in the 1990s, late 1980s, and as an instrument of encirclement and containment of Russia. And maybe there's some new agenda that can be imagined, but the one that's there now is the wrong one for Russia. So this requires a great bit of ingenuity and innovation on part of the U.S. arms control community, which has been hard to find, that ingenuity. The community's everywhere, but the ingenuity not so much. And also in that area is the ban treaty. Some of you will be familiar with the fact that a group of, so a little bit of context for those who don't know this. There's a great deal of international frustration, of course, with the fact that the nuclear weapon states haven't made the progress many would have hoped for in reducing and eliminating nuclear weapons and moving to global zero. And that frustration gets expressed in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty discussions, and it finally erupted in a different way, in part because of the creation of a network of NGOs called the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. And they had a model in mind when they faced this problem. The model is called the Ottawa Convention on Landmines. Here were a bunch of NGOs stuck with the ugly work in the 1980s and 90s of cleaning up the victims of leftover landmines after wars. And they said, why can't we just ban landmines so we don't have this humanitarian crisis after every war in which they're left littering the grounds? And the landmine-armed states said, well, for a good reason you can't have a ban. South Korea is not interested in banning landmines because they're a part of protecting from invasion from the north. And so the NGOs and the pro-ban communities simply got together, and they created a treaty that didn't have any country who possessed landmines, but they created an international treaty. It's called the Ottawa Convention on Landmines. And then they just began to lobby. And more countries signed up, and the Obama administration signed up the United States. Aha! Here's a model for the nuclear disarmament community. So an international campaign against nuclear weapons of NGOs was created, 468 member organizations, and working with some like-minded states. Last summer in the General Assembly, they negotiated a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And it's now got the required number of signatures for entry into force, but not the required number of ratifications. And it's an odd-looking treaty. If you are students of the subject and haven't read the treaty, I commend it to you. It says, for example, that nuclear weapon states will be obliged to eliminate their nuclear weapons, and compliance with the treaty will be guaranteed according to provisions that will be the subject of negotiation with a future designated authority. There you go. No solution to the requirements of enforcement and compliance. In contrast, it's exquisitely clear about the obligation not to cooperate if you're an ally of a nuclear-armed state. And the list of things that you're not supposed to do if you're allied with a nuclear-armed state but join the treaty is identical to the list of things that NATO allies do together to support nuclear deterrence. Add on to this the fact that, so the ICANN director has talked about a pressure and shaming campaign to bring states into compliance. Now, and towards that end, they have on the ICANN website, on the first page, a letter which you can download and send to your parliamentarian. Imagine how influential that letter is going to be in Pyongyang, or Moscow, or Beijing. Plenty influential in the Netherlands, which is one of the countries debating whether or not to remain in the NATO nuclear sharing activities. And where are all of these advocate organizations advocating? Well, there are 0 in Pyongyang, there's 2 in Moscow, there's 1 in Beijing, there are over 100 in France, and over 70 in Norway. So the net effect of the ban treaty, if it makes any headway at all, and it appears likely to, is to call into question, well, directly end extended nuclear deterrence. Whether this is going to make, the preamble to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty says the way you get to nuclear disarmament is by reducing international tensions. I don't think our South Korean, Japanese, Polish, Czech, Estonian allies will feel a relaxation of international tensions when they feel this umbrella pulled away from them. So an element of continuity in arms control policy from Obama to Trump is opposition to this ban treaty, which seems to be not sound. So I'm coming to the end of my time and my outline. Let me make three closing remarks. From a high level, I think it's surprising but fair to say that the Trump administration's nuclear posture review reflects a good deal more continuity with the traditions of U.S. nuclear policy than change. And where there are changes, they are reflective of changes in the security environment. And the one that's most significant, and that I assume we'll take up in the Q&A, so I've kind of downplayed, is the commitment to produce supplemental capabilities to add some low-yield nuclear options to the arsenal, which is a reflection of the administration's assessment of a critical gap in the deterrence posture in Europe. A second main argument is to pick up on the Asia interest here. Asia didn't factor at all in the 1994 review. The 2001 review, China was important as an object of dissuasion, but not so much extended deterrence in the region. And in the 2009 and 10 review, Asia featured very prominently. We set out an agenda for strategic stability with China. We set out an argument about the role of deterrence, nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis China in the region, separate and apart from the role of nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis the North Korean problem. We had a lot to say about extended deterrence in support and the assurance of Japan and South Korea. When it comes to talking with allies, the United States has a mechanism in place in Europe, in NATO, something called the NATO High-Level Group. So when I needed to talk to NATO allies about extended deterrence, there was a ready mechanism to do that. Well, in 2009, we had never spoken with the government of Japan about deterrence, nuclear deterrence, for an obvious historical reason. And it was pretty much the same with the South Korean government. We deployed nuclear weapons into Korea during the Cold War and took them out without ever really doing much consultation. And on the topic of extended deterrence, there'd been no discussion. So whereas the mechanisms existed in the transatlantic relationship, we didn't have them in the trans-Pacific relationship, and we built them. And I was the co-founder of the Extended Deterrence Dialogue with Japan, which continues to operate under that title, and the Extended Deterrence Policy Committee with the ROK, which now has a new name, which I'm not sure what the new name is. And I think the Trump administration gets credit for looking out at the world and seeing that Asia's out there from the perspective of nuclear policy. And it made efforts to be clear about the place of China in its nuclear strategy and extended deterrence and assurance. But its principal complaint about the credibility of extended deterrence isn't in Asia, it's in Europe, where their concern is about the credibility of the posture vis-a-vis Russia. And lastly, a big theme, because a lot of the details of this presentation will wash away from your collective memory, but hopefully one big trend. I think we're passing out of the second main phase in U.S. strategic policy and moving into the third. The first phase was the Cold War, defined as the competitive pursuit of strategic stability, and bipolar, very much focused on the nuclear problem. With the end of the Cold War, the American policy focus shifted very rapidly onto the question represented to us by Saddam Hussein and reflected in the North Korean nuclear program at the time, which is to say our nuclear posture really hasn't been about Russia and China. It's been about North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, and Libya, the different actors over time. And presidents have rejected mutual vulnerability. They've rejected mutual deterrence relationships with Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. We've seen it unacceptable to live in a world where they could deter us. So we were going to adapt our national deterrent posture by adding in missile defenses, non-nuclear but strategic strike capabilities, and we were going to seek disarmament solutions to these problems while making sure deterrence would be effective on our terms. And basically, we accepted, it must be time for me to end. Basically, we accepted that Russia and China would adapt their deterrence to maintain the credibility of those deterrents in their eyes because of what we were doing for a different problem. And our basic orientation to that was laissez-faire. And that's the chapter that's ending. It's not really so clear that we're going to be able to escape mutual deterrence relationship with North Korea unless peace really does break out, and we can talk about that. But it's one thing to stay ahead of North Korea. I mean, right now, our missile the ratio of our missile defense to their ICBMs is 44-0. That's a great ratio. But if North Korea over the next decade goes to 100 deployed ICBMs, can we stay ahead with 400 interceptors? Well, they're very expensive. And 400 interceptors would be really troubling to China and Russia. So we had a kind of Goldilocks approach. We thought we could have a strategic posture big enough to negate the rogues, but not so big as to jeopardize strategic stability with Russia and China. That moment's passing. And it's harder and harder to take a laissez-faire attitude to the adjustments in China's and Russia's nuclear posture. If you watched Mr. Putin's news conference of 6 weeks ago or so, and his introduction of his new strategic military tools, the super transoceanic nuclear armed torpedo, the purpose of which is to generate a radioactive tsunami that would overwhelm our port cities, all of the hypersonic missiles, some space systems, it's hard to just stand by and say, that doesn't matter to us. Or it doesn't matter that the number of nuclear weapons China can deliver onto the United States, which used to be 20, is going to be 200 or more. Laissez-faire, it's hard to be laissez-faire about that. So I think we're coming out of a period in our strategic policy when the choices seemed fairly straightforward, and they're going to get much murkier. And I see the Trump administration's reviews as the first step really in that direction by bringing Russia back into the discussion. So with that, let me thank you for your attention. Let me hope I put enough on the table. Thank you.